In Ephesians chapter 4, Paul encourages Christians to speak the truth in love. What I'm about to say is not a sermon, it's a witness to some of the people who spoke the truth to me in love and who made me who I am. Of course, speaking the truth in love is not always a pleasant experience for the hearer. It's perhaps one of the most misused quotes in the Bible. For example, in about 1982, the Reverend Beth Howard, minister of Wellington Parish, had the crazy idea that she should invite me to lead a workshop for her elders. And I was naive enough to accept. We met in the garden of a farm near Yeovil on a lovely, mild, sunny day. In the afternoon session, sitting in camp chairs on the lawn, I suggested that it was okay for Christians to have doubts. "What do you mean doubts? What sort of doubts?" one man said. Well, doubts about the nature of God, doubts about some of the things in the Bible. "I believe every word in this book," he said, slamming his Bible down. Well, maybe he thought he was speaking the truth in love, but I felt pretty intimidated because I continued to have doubts. Now, though, I've come to understand that doubts about faith are a sign of maturity. That indeed, without doubt, there can be no faith. For 25 years or so, I spent about 1,000 hours a year working for the church, most of it in the presbytery, the synod and the assembly, and mostly as a volunteer. I gave a lot to the church, but the church repaid me 100-fold. It's fashionable to see the church beyond our local congregation as interfering nuisances. But for me, my participation in the committees and councils of the church was formational and transformational. From when I was a teenager, I felt a vague sense of call to ministry, hence the picture on the cover of the worship book today of the child Samuel. At about age 28, I became an elder of Narromine Presbyterian Church, and about 5 years later, in the mid-1970s, I became the lay representative to Dubbo Presbytery, a tiny group of 8 Presbyterian congregations which were scattered from Wellington to Backerburg. At that time, we began talking with the Orange Synod of the Methodist Church in preparation for the formation of the Uniting Church. I met a Methodist man named Jack Scoble, who operated a farm machinery business in Parkes. Jack was the long-time mayor of Parkes and was very active in the church, both in the local church and in the wider Methodist church. Jack's favourite story was, sometimes people say to me, "Jack, you should be in the ministry." And Jack would always reply, "But I am in the ministry of the laity." Back in the 1970s, that was a pretty radical statement. In the ministry meant ordained ministry, ministry with a capital M. Lay people might do stuff around the church, but they were just working for the church or helping the minister. Jack Scoble saw ministry as the ministry of the laos of God, the whole people of God, ordained and non-ordained, working in partnership together. And I began to see that perhaps I was called to this ministry of the laity. I certainly never felt called to ordained ministry. I became a passionate advocate for lay ministry, but sadly I was not always wise enough to recognise that some ministers saw this advocacy as a threat to their status and their role. But not all of them. In 1981 I was elected chairperson of the Presbytery of the Central West, mostly because the capital M ministers encouraged me to stand. At that time, the Reverend John Payton, a consultant from the Board of Mission, visited our Narromine Trangie parish. John stayed in our home and he seemed very interested in the farm. I was delighted to have a captive audience as I enthusiastically talked about the crops we grew, the machinery we used, when we planted, when we harvested, when we irrigated, how we irrigated, where we sold the crop, how we sold the crop. And then when I paused for breath, John said, "And where's God in all this?" I was stunned because I'd never really thought about that. But the question took me straight back to Jack Scoble. Was God involved in my daily life as a farmer? Or was my ministry just what I did in the church? I was an elder and lay preacher in my parish. I served 2 years as chairperson of Presbytery. I'd been a member of the Synod and its standing committee. I'd been a member of the 1982 Assembly. I knew that all of that was ministry because that was in the church. But what about all the rest? Jack Scoble saw that what he did in the church, what he did in local government, what he did in his farm machinery business, what he did among his family and friends, all of that was ministry. John Payton and Jack Scoble challenged me to see all of life as ministry. A few years later, in the mid-1980s, I was in a meeting of the Synod Standing Committee. We were discussing something to do with Indigenous people. At that stage, I was still a very conservative country boy. My theology and my political views were still the product of conservative Anglican Sunday school and a posh boarding school education. I was a rusted-on country party voter. So I was stunned by the radical ideas being expressed at the meeting. Support for Aboriginal land rights, Indigenous self-determination, praising subversive leaders like Charles Perkins. So I made a speech opposing the proposal. And Peter Tebbit, a wonderful, gentle lay leader of the church, stood up and said, "I want to say that I love Bruce dearly, but I want to disagree violently with everything he said." And then he proceeded to demolish every argument I'd made. Peter Tebbit was able to speak the truth in love in a way which enabled me to recognise my assumptions of entitlement and privilege and my unconscious racism. He spoke in a way which didn't belittle me and which didn't alienate me. He confronted my assumptions and prejudices, but he did it in a way which gave me space to change my convictions. Peter Tebbit offered me a profound epiphany, and he sparked in me a passion for justice. Another epiphany followed in 1990, just before I served as moderator of the Synod. A lady that we met briefly in Canada gave us some audio tapes of Bishop John Shelby Spong's series of addresses to the Manitoba Conference of the United Church of Canada. I'd been mildly supportive at that stage of LGBTIQ inclusion, but Bishop Spong's exegesis of the biblical text finally released me from the hang-ups of my Wellington encounter with biblical literalism. Spong gave me the courage and the language to advocate for LGBTIQ inclusion as I met with congregations and presbyteries and elders as I moved around the state as moderator. I'm still remembered in some places as the heretic moderator. One day I was guest at a morning service followed by a community lunch. A friendly young man came up to chat. He said, "That sermon of yours this morning," and I nodded, half expecting the polite flattery that a moderator often gets. "Right, Shirley?" "That was the greatest load of crap I've ever heard." Perhaps my most formational experience of all was my 9-year membership of the Assembly National Mission and Evangelism Committee. In a committee comprising hotshot mission and evangelism practitioners from all over Australia, I was the token rural person, and I was the one person there who knew nothing about mission nor evangelism. We met for a weekend twice a year in Sydney, beginning on Friday night, ending Sunday lunchtime. Two things stand out from that experience. In the first Friday evening session of the very first meeting, the chairperson, Reverend Dorothy McMahon, said that she had not wanted to chair that committee. She'd agreed only because she was told she could do something different. Dorothy explained that each person was to have as long as they needed to talk about what was happening in their life. She took the lead and talked a little about her work life, but mostly about her personal life in a very vulnerable way. Others followed, but by the end of that first Friday evening session, less than half the group had actually spoken. And as a task-oriented person, I was appalled. The church had spent hundreds of dollars to fly about 15 people to Sydney from all over Australia, people who I was sure had much more important things to do than gaze at our navels. I also knew there was an agenda of business, but it looked as though we might never even get started on that. But eventually, just before lunch on day 2, we tackled the agenda. To my surprise, we breezed through that agenda in double quick time. It took me a while to work out that Dorothy had transformed this group of strangers into a community. And because the members of the community knew and understood one another, nobody needed to grandstand. Nobody needed to give long-winded justifications for what they were saying. The business proceeded effectively and efficiently. After a couple of years of these twice-a-year meetings, I realised that I would have been quite happy to skip the business sessions and go home after the community sharing time, because I had again encountered this wonderful community. One of the wonderful things about this Pitt Street congregation is our sense of community. Liz and I have been coming here for 9 years now. And this community gives us life. It gives us connection. We know that we're loved in this community. The second standout from the National Mission and Evangelism Committee was that we spent a lot of time developing a vision statement for the Assembly to adopt in 1987. Working through draft after draft, the committee finally settled on the vision: to be a uniting church in Australia which risks living the way of Jesus, participates in God's action in the world, enables people to discover new life through the Spirit, and to live by that discovery. To risk living the way of Jesus encapsulates for me the heart of discipleship, the core of being a Christian. 31 years later, it still thrills me to hear people use that phrase: to risk living the way of Jesus. To risk the way of grace, grace received and grace offered. I am indeed so fortunate to have had Beth Howard, Jack Scoble, John Payton, Peter Tebbett, John Shelby Spong, Dorothy McMahon, the leadership team of this congregation, and many, many others speak the truth to me in love.